Our next speaker is Manu Karuka. Manu is an associate professor in American Studies at Barnard College and is the author of Empire's Tracks, Plains Indians, Chinese Migrants, and the Transcontinental Railroad. Manu, please go ahead.
Thanks, Bikram. I want to start by thanking our hosts and salute my co-panelists and everyone else on the Zoom. It's really wonderful to see all of you here. Can you hear me? Is this coming through? Okay. I'm going to focus on the moment of 1992 to think about our broader question. A moment of apparent victory for capitalism and a moment which set into place habits of, let's say, the attrition or deterioration of class analysis and class politics, as well as the deterioration of organizational politics, and focus on the necessity of organization, which both put us in very difficult, dire circumstances at the moment now, in the crisis we're living through now. In comparison to war, ending with the withdrawal of forces from the battlefield, Gramsci argued that political struggle is enormously more complex. In political struggle, as in colonial warfare, the victorious army occupies or proposes to occupy permanently all or a part of the conquered territory, while the defeated army is disarmed and dispersed. As in situations of colonial occupation, however, the struggle continues on an altered terrain. Gramsci's insights can provide us an opening to consider the end of the Cold War in 1992. Much grander than the end of the Cold War, Francis Fukuyama argued 1989 marked the endpoint of mankind's ideological evolution through the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. Claiming that the class issue has actually been successfully resolved in the West, Fukuyama presented class struggle as an ideological relic of bygone times. The end of history for Fukuyama was the end of class struggle. Fukuyama's end of history was not only the triumph of capitalism over socialism, it was also the triumph of the West, of the Western idea, taking two forms. First, the total exhaustion of viable systematic alternatives to Western liberalism, and second, the ineluctable spread of Western consumerist culture. Behind Fukuyama's triumphalism is the question of imperialism. 1989 for Fukuyama bookended the 20th century, which began and now returned to a state of self-confidence in the ultimate triumph of Western liberal democracy. The inheritors of the so-called great powers, now calling themselves the G7, celebrated an unabashed victory of economic and political liberalism. While the bulk of the third world, Fukuyama warned, remains very much mired in history, he concluded that the simple existence of communist China constitutes a threat to liberalism. In a November 1991 talk delivered at the Smith Center for Private Enterprise Studies at Cal State Hayward, Milton Friedman distinguished between economic, human, and political freedom. Friedman lauded Hong Kong as one of the freest, if not the freest, of countries in the world, blessed with a free market that had arisen from the designs of British colonial officials and a great deal of human freedom in the form of free speech and press freedoms. In one respect, Friedman conceded, Hong Kong had no freedom whatsoever. In a curious formulation, he suggested that Hong Kong residents did not choose freedom, it was imposed on them. This disjuncture between economic and political freedom also shaped his analysis of Chile, presenting the Pinochet dictatorship as a restoration of Chile's democratic process. As examples of economic freedom, Friedman offered colonial rule on the one hand and military dictatorship on the other. This may be resonant with Nina's analysis of fascism and capitalism. Against these spaces of economic freedom, Friedman alleged that India and other British colonies that were given political freedom, quote unquote, given political freedom in the post-war era, have for the most part destroyed economic and human freedoms. And he concluded that economic freedom facilitates political freedom, but political freedom has a tendency to destroy economic freedom. Gramsci had critically assessed the Italian communist movement's actions in the period prior to the rise of fascism. Avoiding the basic problem, the problem of power, the movement had instead diverted popular attention to secondary objectives, while hypocritically concealing the ruling class responsibility for the crisis. Diversion, concealment, and disunity also shaped certain theoretical perspectives at the close of the Cold War. In their 1987 essay, Post-Marxism Without Apologies, Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe had anticipated Fukuyama's arguments about the obsolescence of Marxism, proclaiming that socialism needed to be reformulated through discursive struggles over rights and equality. Jettisoning class struggle at the heart of their proposed transcendence of Marxism is a basic consensus with Fukuyama's position. For Laclau and Mouffe, struggle is defined by qualities of variety and autonomy that align neatly with Friedman's free private market, so apparently indifferent to social identities. Post-Marxism counseled a bizarre kind of mysticism, predicting a transcendence of bourgeois power through the mechanisms of bourgeois power. In her 1993 essay, Feminism, Citizenship, and Radical Democratic Politics, Mouffe clarified both the turn away from class struggle and the engagement within the framework of liberal democracy, embedded in the call for post-Marxism, which she shared with Laclau. Class, in her approach, is a type of identity, an equivalent articulation with other identities, not a relationship within a given mode of production. Rather than class struggle, this was instead an amorphous model of struggle against what she called forms of subordination. Mouffe advocated a model of radical and plural democracy. Prior to capitalism, Gramsci noted, the ruling classes were essentially conservative, conceiving of themselves as a closed caste. The rising bourgeoisie, as an open, dynamic class, presented itself as culturally and economically capable of absorbing all of society. The state form of the bourgeoisie reflected this dynamism and openness. Over time, however, as this process of dynamism ground to a halt, the state returned to relations of pure force. As competition is replaced by monopoly and capitalism becomes moribund, the bourgeois class becomes saturated, in Gramsci's terms. It stops growing, beginning to shrink. The bourgeois state in the era of imperialism reflects these patterns of decay. What possibilities obtained for a radical plural democracy in an age of imperialism? In 1992, the central government of India under the Congress Party opened India's domestic economy to international financial capital, a policy of liberalization. At the end of the year, Hindutva forces demolished the Babri Masjid, a historic mosque in Ayodhya, in a brazenly criminal act of collective violence. Winter 1992 also saw the publication of Dipesh Chakrabarty's essay, Post-Coloniality and the Artifice of History. Conceding to Fukuyama that the end of history is in sight for us in India, Chakrabarty framed Indian history itself in a position of subalternity, while acknowledging that this position left him open to charges of nativism, nationalism, or worse, nostalgia. Chakrabarty would admit the real danger of an Indian Hindu fascism in a 1995 essay, while contending that this danger was sometimes exaggerated. In a pair of astonishingly prescient talks, the first given on December 27, 1992 in Calcutta, and the second in early December 1993 in Hyderabad, Ajaz Ahmed addressed these questions, cautioning against transporting ideas developed for a specific moment of struggle. Ahmed nonetheless asserted that a certain kind of ghostly resonance with the Indian situation could be found in a careful reading of Gramsci. Rather than the prototype of all bourgeois revolutions, Ahmed pointed out, the French Revolution was in fact a very notable exception. The increasing conservatism of the bourgeoisie across Europe following the French Revolution spurred a wave of national revolutions through alliances between the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy, presenting a united front against the threat of worker-peasant insurgencies. Ahmed insisted that ideological struggle against Hindutva would need to engage traditions of struggle inherited from pre-colonial anti-Brahmanical movements, alongside the legacies of the nationalist movement. Together, he argued, these histories imprinted the spiritual and political consciousness of tens of millions of rural households across India, shaping democratic traditions which had developed out of centuries of class struggle in Southern Asia. Ideological struggle in itself was insufficient to defeat Hindutva. In order to be credible, ideologies of secularism and democracy would need to take concrete form through struggles to radically restructure property relations and systems of governance, giving the popular classes a real, tangible stake in the anti-fascist struggle. The critical rejection of nation as a political category conceded the ground of social struggle. It marked a particularly sharp failure, in a Gramscian sense, in a moment of rise for the extreme right. Nation, Ahmed emphasized, is not a thing. Like class, nation is a process, is a terrain of struggle. To critically examine nationalism in a Gramscian sense requires us to study historical trajectories of class struggle. Likewise, the Gramscian concept of consent. Ahmed reminds us that Gramsci's immediate concern was not consent to parliamentary democracy, but consent to fascism. Gramsci struggled with how best to understand mass consent in Italy for the fascist project of Mussolini and how to combat it. Fascism, Ahmed insisted, is a kind of nationalism, competing with the historical traditions invoked by other forms of nationalism, such as anti-colonial nationalisms. Fascist movements unified diverse social strata by distilling the lingering rot of an anachronistic history, endowing these new unities with power, purpose, and intellectual location. In India, at the heart of this lingering rot was a masculinist mobilization in the name of a unitary Hinduism. The image of the family was crucial to Hindutva, drawing in its strictly all-male fronts through the centrifugal forces of patriarchy. In India, even after the destruction of Babri Masjid, a certain complacency about the fascist threat led many to feel free to carry on with our sectarian habits, focusing critical efforts within theoretical hermeneutics or against the organized left. The rise of extreme right movements in India, Europe, and elsewhere in the late 1980s occurred alongside the development of academic critiques of the nation as a political category and the deterioration of class analysis. As in the era of classical fascism, this took place in a period of capitalist stagnation, following the retreat from social democracy in the wealthy industrialized countries, the dismantling of radical nationalism in recently decolonized countries, and the demise of mass communist parties in Western Europe. Hindutva's rescripted nationalism, with its mythos of an eternal strong nation, marked a repudiation of the anti-colonial project, a willing subordination to imperialism. Although Hindutva developed in conditions specific to India, its rise in the early 1990s, Ahmed argued, exemplified a general tendency across the world at that moment. Movements of the extreme right stabilized the twin defeat of communism and anti-imperialist nationalism, cementing the triumph of imperialism in a moment of capitalist stagnation. In this historical moment, he continued, neoliberal economic policies combined with irrationalist populism to provide a general solution for the period of stagnation. Reading Gramsci can help situate these developments in a longer historical trajectory. For Gramsci, Ahmed points out, it was only in May 1871, after their decisive victory over the Commune, that the French bourgeoisie was able to stabilize its rule, thanks to a new imperialist economy fueled by colonial wars in Africa and Asia. Contra Fukuyama, with his presentation of a timeless French Revolution as the endpoint of humanity's ideological evolution, Gramsci understood that the defeat of the Commune entailed the final exhaustion of the dynamics first unleashed in 1798. These are the terms: defeat of the working class and the rise of a new imperialist economy, not some timeless liberal democracy that lurked behind Fukuyama's thesis, the celebrant of mass murder dressed in professorial tweed. Fascism, Ahmed argued, has two faces. On the one hand, it involves massive cultural and ideological upheaval, deploying a machinery of terror across society. On the other hand, fascism involves a comprehensive economic restructuring, achieving transformations which the bourgeoisie had been unable to achieve through the existing channels of the liberal state. In this process, large segments of the capitalist class are brought over to the side of fascism. Widespread passivity among the working classes and the peasantry, and simultaneous political and social initiatives in the hands of the professional classes and small business owners facilitates the rise of this pathological nationalism. To combat fascism, Ahmed maintained, it is necessary to remember that conservatism is born not only from privilege and the will to protect privilege, but also from the experience of pain and the fear of future pain. Amidst near universal misery in working class and poor communities across India's cities, the RSS offered compensatory hallucinations of power to address real and perceived suffering. In such a situation, Ahmed insisted, fascism can only be fought through the organization of a collective human agency, which addresses the linkages between moral reform and the transformations of material life. Fascism, in other words, can only be fought with class struggle. Thank you.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.